Well, I do think that that a lot of writers have a very strong visual sensibility anyhow, and you find a lot of writers who are incorporating lots of visual information in their work, and also writers who are big audience members of the visual arts, and even perhaps critics. So there's a lot more crossover among the disciplines than I think might be immediately apparent. But I also think that more and more there's an evolution of art forms breaking down cross-disciplinary work happening, where artists are following interests in language, and people who, I mean, I often think that artists is the better term to use, and that writer and visual artist kind of segregates things too much. Where I often think that writers are artists who use language. They're interested in language. And you see more and more visual artists like, you know, somebody like John Baldessari, who his whole life's work is about language, and yet he's operating in this world. And so I often think that it's about the separation of worlds, where you have people who call themselves writers operating in this literary world, who have so much to bring to the visual art world, and vice versa. In terms of the work that I've done, I think what I would say about what I've been trying to do is that it's about synthesis. It's about trying to bring together as much of the things that I'm interested in into a work, and yet I'm also very aware that I try to focus and ground the work in poetry, because that's my primary love. When I was confronted with looking at rural Ireland and the landscape of rural Ireland in 2007, 2008, there was no turning away from what was happening to the landscape. It was in all of our faces. And I felt angry about what was happening, and I also felt powerless. And I was also aware that I wasn't the only one who felt that way. And in my talking and listening to people in the town that I lived in, I was aware that there was a lot being said that was said in a very private way. And it was said in a private way because of the politics of language and power. And I think there's a way that an artist can be very didactic and alienating if they speak about politics in such a way that they separate themselves from the community that they live in, and they put themselves on a higher perch. And I don't think anybody's interested in that very far. I don't think people really listen. But I think there is a way that one can position oneself among people and on the same ground as the people that we live among. And when we, as artists, as writers, as members of a community, listen, and listen carefully, we can give voice to a community where issues of power and language and politics come into play. And I think those were the thoughts that were going through my mind in that project that I eventually called an airing. With the word airing, giving voice to just that it was an opportunity to air what I heard and to be a kind of conduit. And I think that, another example is, that was a public art project, but a writer of fiction is doing that as well, in a subtle way and in sometimes a subversive way. I think this one simple answer is that yes, there are hidden barriers, or maybe overt barriers, in that when you go to the newsletters that writers, the professional resources that writers have, there are very few advertisements for public art commissions and % for art projects. Whereas if you compare it to the same in the visual arts world, it's bursting with them, So that's certainly something that is easily changed. I think that there's also this barrier perceived because of the discipline nature, or the barriers among disciplines, and that somehow writers, if they are engaging mostly in the literary world, really do see public art commission as something other, something not for me, right? However, having said that, I think that there is a history of writers having done public art projects, but under other names. There's a lot of work that writers have done having to do with going out into the community, finding stories that are little told or difficult to express, and giving tools to people to bring those stories into being. Are public art projects that have been going on in writing disciplines for a really long time. And the same with writers coming into healthcare settings. And so there's already a wealth of experience and tools that writers have that they can bring to public art projects just by naming them different, by seeing them that what they have done is experience that they can bring to public art projects. I think a couple of suggestions I'd have is one, to look at public art as an opportunity not only to author a collection of poems, a piece of fiction, but as perhaps an opportunity to look at the whole idea of authorship as a concept that is worth deconstructing a little bit. And it may be an opportunity to stretch your idea as a writer as to what an end result might be. I think the idea of collaborating with other people, visual artists as an example, is a good way for a writer interested in this thing to join in partnership with a person who has done a public artwork before, most likely a visual artist, and together to approach an idea or a problem. But also to be cautious that in that kind of partnership, that it isn't the writer who gets to be the word person and the visual artist who gets to be the picture and the design person, that actually a writer could have really interesting insight into other things than words and language, you know. So there's an opportunity there, I think, for research. And I think that was the other thing that I was going to say in response to your question, is I think writers are listeners. You have to be. It's the chief quality that you need to be any kind of fiction writer or playwright, is you're listening, you're sensitive to language. And so a public art commission is a perfect opportunity for research, for going out and listening and gathering. And if you are a writer interested in language, in culture, in ideas about translation, it's a perfect opportunity for doing research and then for seeing how your research can turn into something that you can't imagine or you can't expect.